Okay, well, Marcelo, first of all, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here as OU, and welcome to Oklahoma. To get started, I want to ask you a question that seems pertinent. Since we're here, you're in a different place, and we're doing this interview in public for Latin American Literature Today, WLT. And that's, when reading your work, I've noticed that you talk a lot about silence, kind of keeping quiet, and especially as an undocumented person, having to keep things hidden, to keep things secret. So what does it feel like now to be so loud, to put it in those terms, to be able to kind of express yourself in such a public way?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, and thanks for everybody for being here. It's an honor. It's kind of ironic to be a writer, but also have this looming fear of saying things or fear of speaking, and that's probably one of the reasons why I probably got into writing very early in life, because it was kind of a way to do both, to say what I wanted to say while at the same time maintaining some kind of control over either who could hear me or what they could extrapolate from it. You know, I was always very conscious of things that got away from me, things that people would think about me without me being able to explain them. So silence for me was a constant throughout, you know, my entire life. Silence has always been the go-to survival mechanism, you know, repeated over and over by my family, that no matter how well you know somebody, no matter how connected you think you are, you don't tell them certain things about you, and these things were about documentation. And it was a very different time then in terms of acceptance in the community, where there was a lot more stigma to be undocumented, like in the 90s and early 2000s, even among circles of friends, even among circles of like-minded people. You know, I think I read in the next book that the border doesn't really exist in the southern. That's only like a marker. It really exists where people take it, and the silences that we're forced to put on ourselves in the aftermath of migration, in the aftermath of that trauma, fearing that there is always the chance of something or someone out to get you. So that kind of paranoia kind of led me to write you know, my first book, the Book of Poems, to write it in such a way that I could, through like a very, through like a very, well, how would you say, a surrealistic lens, being able to hide through images, hide behind images. Yeah, I think my first book of poems is a very quiet book, because I was able to say what I wanted to say without fear of the consequences.
And your poems are very charged with images, I would say. Quiet, like you say, sometimes, but also very kind of physical, very visual. And I'm interested to kind of know how you came to that type of poetry, you could say, and how you came to poetry in general. In your essay, Poetry as a Passport, which is published on BuzzFeed, and which I suggest everyone checks out, you kind of give a biography of how you came to writing as a way to express yourself and as a way to kind of bring some, make sound out of the silence that you're, as you say, you experienced. So how were those first steps into poetry? What were those initial influences? And how did you kind of approach those as someone coming necessarily from without?
Yeah. Well, I didn't write a poem in the first person until well after, you know, many years of being interested in poetry, being interested in reading poetry, literature. It wasn't only until I got accepted into this writing retreat in Northern California where I was kind of removed from the environment in which I had spent most of my life that I was finally able to write the word I in the poem, and I could pinpoint it to that week, which is kind of I think unique that I can do that because my memory is terrible. I do remember that point in which I was able to put myself in a poem rather than coming to poetry from kind of the outside. And as it says in that essay, I was okay with, and this was kind of like in high school where I really I didn't know what the literary landscape was like. I was okay with coming to poetry rather than existing inside of it because I didn't feel like I belonged to it. I didn't see myself in some of the writers that I read, but a lot of that has changed, and I feel like I do now see myself very much, you know, working within the literary landscape and responding to, collaborating with, and just contributing something to that landscape, I hope.
You've maybe used poetry to respond to the situation that is in itself, like you say, very much built upon language, right? A lack of documents, like a lack of certain words written on pieces of paper. So I think that's a very fascinating part of your practice. Maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of other efforts you've made with Undocu Poets, things along those lines to help increase access for other undocumented writers to these institutions. I'm thinking specifically of MFA programs, literary prizes, different things like this, which really are, I think, increasingly necessary or seen as necessary one way or another to make this a space for yourself in this world, right?
Yeah, you know, there are certain things as small as changing something on the website, the introductory website to an MFA program, you know, what we're about, to saying like we are a program inclusive of all documentation statuses. Even just that, to somebody who doesn't know the inner workings of what's going on in a school or a different kind of program or anything like that, it gives somebody the hope that there is somebody behind the scenes kind of advocating for that and will advocate for you. So the Undocu Poets work that Javier Zamora, Christopher Soto, and I started, and who is now directed by myself, a poet who teaches at Oklahoma State. Her name is Janine Joseph, and another poet, Esther Lynn. The continued work that we've been doing is to find other pockets of experiences, of exclusionary experiences, which still exist. I mean, when my book got published, we got an email from the National Book Award asking, you know, if we are to consider this, will you be a citizen by the time, and fortunately, after being granted DACA in 2013, and not through DACA, but through other circumstances, I was able to adjust my status and become a permanent resident. Even then, you know, I still wouldn't qualify for things like the National Book Award, the Guggenheim, the Pulitzer. Not to say I would get the Pulitzer, but the NEA I think you can still apply to. But there are still certain barriers of access that, you know, for some people it's like, why bother? Why bother? And the latest iteration that two of the co-founders kind of after they left their positions as leading Undocu Poets did, the Migrants for Writers' Justice, along with two of our current Undocu Poets fellows. this whole campaign was nationwide, and you know, there was a campaign here in Oklahoma City. There was a reading here in Oklahoma City, and pretty much in every major city in the country, they raised well over $25,000 just by spreading the word and having people come to readings, which I think tells us a lot about what we can accomplish as writers, what our role in literary activism is, and what our responsibilities are. Another project that I'm going to be starting with a poet named Tess Taylor is a campaign in which people will be promising to lead each of their poetry readings between now and the November election, with the preface of trying to turn their reading into a fundraiser for Immigrant Families Together, or other great projects like the Florence Project, which gives free legal assistance, bond aid to migrants detained at the border. Because I feel like people need to know, they need to hear it from somebody they trust of how to help. It's really eye-opening to know and talk to people who say, I want to help, I just don't know how. I'm willing to help, I just don't know how. So that's gonna be kind of our next project, is to try to convince our hosts for each of our readings, and have just as many writers who signed up for, like, the Writers for Migrant Justice, also, you know, pledge to turn their readings into, preface their readings with organizations people can help support, and fundraisers that people can donate to.
I think that it's interesting as well, speaking of literary activism, or as literature as a kind of activism and vice versa. Earlier we were talking about your work at the moment, teaching within an MFA program and also working with incarcerated youth. And I'd be interested to just mention again kind of what you see as the kind of the progress that can be made in that area, maybe what you've learned and what you feel you've been able to teach working with youth, and maybe how that compares working with people who are kind of within an institution, like learning literature in an MFA, versus people who have been very much excluded from the opportunity to do that, who are having this chance to kind of maybe be exposed to that for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, well, both groups are part of, like, a structural institution, right? A very different kind. And I've learned a lot from working with these kids. I feel like I need to up my game in terms of being a teacher, in terms of being a good teacher, where I've taken for granted a lot of the things that I teach, that I say, okay, my students either should know this or should be interested in this, and so, you know, do a lot of their own work. For me, it's been really both rewarding and challenging and eye-opening experience. You know, I still teach some of the same poems in both, and at the very core of it, it's, you know, what is a poem? You know, how do we just express some of our basic experiences? I just feel fortunate that they're able to trust me with their experiences, because a lot of them, it's a majority male population, even though the juvenile hall there is co-ed. You know, they have trusted to be vulnerable in telling their experiences in a way that has much more risk than an MFA program. You know, we're always taught to write what feels like like we're taking a risk, write what is important to us, and you know, our subject matter is important to us. In the workshops that I handle that I teach at the juvenile hall, these kids are reliving a lot of their traumas and dealing with them, and trusting that their friends around them wouldn't judge them for you know, writing a very sentimental poem, or writing a poem about a subject that they wouldn't want to normally write about. Yeah, the risk there is a lot more on the surface. Mm-hmm. One time there was a fight because a student felt that his poem was being kind of ridiculed. I didn't see that student for another few weeks because they restricted him from coming to the poetry workshops. But they want to come to the workshops. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, it's they want to be there, and so that's kind of special for me.
Latin American literature today is always trying to emphasize translation. Mm-hmm. I'm a big translation nerd myself. That's something that you do as well. So I'm interested to know, I guess, first of all, just how you got started with that, kind of how you came into it. Was that something that came through exposure in classes, or something that you just came to personally?
Yeah. Again, going back to that idea that in the 90s and the 2000s, mid 2000s, even up until like 2010, 2011, 12. For me personally, it was very difficult to reconcile. I mean, I'm perfectly fluent in Spanish and English. Spanish is my first language, but I speak it just as well as in English, and I can write it well as well. Mm-hmm. But I feel like I always had to hide that part of myself because it said too much about me, you know, shamefully so. I wish I wouldn't have done that for as many years as I felt like I had to, in order to just fly under the radar, in order to just get by. And it was a friend of mine, a mentor, a dear friend who has since passed away. She asked me one day, "Is like, hey, do you translate?" And I didn't think about it, and I was like, "Well, I know both languages. I can help you." She's like, "Yeah, because I'm having trouble with this phrase. Can you help me?" And she sent me like a few pages of, I forget whose work it was by, and she really she gave me like permission to function in Spanish. From that moment of being asked to, you know, help her out with something, it kind of just awoke something in me that I felt had been missing, and it was it kind of just grew and grew until then I started doing my own, and then we continued to collaborate as well. Mm-hmm. So for me, the only translation that I really done was doctors' forms for my parents, the DMV, not the DMV, verbal translation, mm-hmm. You know, at the mechanic. And these are very practical approaches to translation, right? So you have to be efficient, you have to be very quick, and I think I did carry some of that into my literary translation. But that was kind of like my beginning. And unfortunately she passed away, and I continued some of the work that we did together afterwards and sent it to her partner. Yeah, since then I've been really interested in reading bilingual work also, work by individual authors who translate their own work and publish it bilingually. I was just teaching Francisco X. Alarcón, who writes a lot of bilingual poetry. Yeah, and it was that moment, it was like that linchpin moment that kind of gave me permission to finally go back to Spanish.
I always think it's interesting to see it kind of as almost a little bit similar to acting, I guess, kind of getting in their character, right? And kind of, that can be what's fun about it, is like living in the other person's mind for a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I think that even in your poetry, I've noticed that there's an element sometimes of different voices interacting, an element of character performance. Thinking of your poems, I remember a couple from your book that I read, the style of interviews where there's like an interviewer and someone answering questions. Do you think in your own writing as well as translation that there's an element of kind of multiple voices playing different parts?
Yeah, yeah. That was really for me. That poem was really about the interview, like the interview as a form of knowledge, the interview of that produces I don't want to say product because that has like weird capitalistic insinuations, but that produces a new thing and that produces a body of knowledge, right? And so even if it's, a late night talk show host interview in which it's either with Don Francisco or Jay Leno or David Letterman, I didn't translate anything in my book of poems. Everything just existed either in Spanish or in English, and there wasn't any bridges in between or any markers that would explain what was being said in Spanish. I mean, because it's weird because I exist in both languages. In the memoir, in the prose book, it was a really difficult decision, and I went back through all 113,000 words, sifting through dialogues in Spanish. My mother doesn't know English, so how do I present her to my audience? Do I present her in Spanish and then translate in Spanish and explain the translations by context clues that they can pretty much guess what is being said, or a combination of both, or strictly in English? So that was a very difficult decision.
We were speaking earlier as well about your new book, your memoir, Children of the Land, and maybe you could say a little bit about what it was like making this transition from poetry to prose, and also you talked about kind of writing this with a tighter deadline. It sounds like this book was just in general different from everything you've done before for a number of reasons. So what was that experience like? Yeah,
I mean, in general, it is a much more lyrical book, because of the fact that I approached it as a poet. But one of the starkest differences was I could no longer, I don't want to say hide, but I could no longer be as comfortable talking about myself as I did in the book of poems, because in the book of poems it was a lot more highly imagistic, symbolic, surreal, and I was comfortable in that ethereal space. There's no mention of any really or many times or places in the book. I think it only mentions one actual place and another actual time, 1959, a year that my uncle was born, and Esparto, California, this town west of Davis, California, where my mom spent a lot of time working. But other than that, it's not placed in any time. So coming to a memoir that you have to reveal facts, right? It has led to a lot of family drama about, what can we say about ourselves and what do we want to say about ourselves? It was very, very difficult to navigate that fine line between what I still can say, what I still cannot, because a lot of the things that I talk about are still in process.
Right.
They're still in the works. They're still what I say could affect them. And so I had to be really careful with that, and also just coming to terms with writing in a more autobiographical manner, not having that subtlety that I had in the book of poems, and then also having a timeline. I had to finish it in 2 years. But in the end, I think I'm really, really happy with what we ended up producing, because it's very different than what I ended up pitching. What I pitched is very different than what we ended up coming up with between me and my editor, and she was okay with it. So now that it's over, the next project that I have in mind, I'm not sure if it'll be poetry or poems. I'm not sure what vehicle it'll take, what container it will be in.